If you're not familiar with the hellscape of Hollywood, it is essentially a modern form of one of those Hieronymus Bosch medieval visions of damnation, except with the additions of Botox, lip filler, and identity politics. At the heart of this is Disney, which acquired Marvel Studios in 2009 for $4 billion, and then, after looking down the side of the couch and emptying out the petty cash tin in the office, acquired Lucasfilm and Star Wars in 2012 for another $4 billion. With ownership of two of the most beloved intellectual properties of all time, Disney was set on a cloudless, tranquil course toward global shores of critical acclaim, bounteous wealth, and sheer movie magic that would unite diverse peoples through the irresistible force of creative imagination, striking at the humanist and aspirational spirit within all of us. Since we're talking about entities that might be quite different to lots of people, it's important to clarify that there is little difference functionally between them. Marvel is a division of Disney, who has full ownership of their operations and all of their properties. In his recent book, Disney CEO Bob Iger relayed how he has meetings with Marvel Studio head Kevin Feige. During these meetings, Iger says, we mull potential characters to introduce, consider sequels and franchises that might add to the existing Marvel Cinematic Universe. We consider actors and directors and think about how the various stories can be cross-pollinated. As for Star Wars, Lucasfilm makes the Star Wars movies and Kathleen Kennedy heads Lucasfilm, but she still has to report and answer to Disney, which has creative input on the Star Wars films, just like any other studio does with the films it distributes. So, in other words, Bob Iger is Palpatine, the all-powerful presence orchestrating the grand narrative, and Kevin Feige is Grand Moff Tarkin, and Kathleen Kennedy is Admiral Ozzel. Although that analogy doesn't quite work because Ozzel, characterized by hubris and constantly bungling things, was at least disposed of and replaced fairly quickly, whereas Kathleen Kennedy has stayed naggingly in place forever. So perhaps consider her the Sarlacc, luring in creative life in its grasping tentacles and dragging it into a slimy, spiky abyss to be digested in a new definition of pain and suffering over 1,000 years. In looking at Disney's crashing appeal, let's start with Disney Star Wars and Lucasfilm. Now, old Pappy Echo Chamberlain is going to have to summon you over to the fireside and have you sit down at his knee, and in the flickering glow of the gentle firelight, and your face raised, and sitting with your legs drawn up and your arms wrapped around them, eyes wide and guileless, you have to have some hard truths meted out to you about this whole Star Wars business. You see, we haven't really had this out properly. But there comes a time in an impressionable person's life when they have to set aside their sentimental and naive notions and hear from the lips of a trusted mentor and confidant just how things really are. And so, as a tentative caress of your knee becomes a more furtive, encroaching slide up your nightshirt and thence to your nether regions, in a transgression that is to remain our little secret, let me tell you that Star Wars The Force Awakens was a financial monolith, but its substance was risk-averse, pat, lacking in spirit and magic, and its new heroes and villains were absolutely confoundingly boring. Bob Iger writes of George Lucas's first viewing of the film. Just prior to the global release, Kathleen Kennedy screened The Force Awakens for George. He didn't hide his disappointment. There's nothing new, he said. In each of the films and the original trilogy, it was important to him to present new worlds, new stories, new characters, and new technologies. The Last Jedi, as the world knows, was a bloated, divisive sequel with common-sense expectations about the depiction of male characters in an action fantasy sci-fi film prissily subverted, and the antagonists rendered farcical, moodily neurotic and bumbling. As for the rise of Skywalker, well, some things are only to be discussed rarely, and with a kind of terse reluctance, with lowered gazes and in gruff, hushed tones, referencing a shared experience that can neither be properly confronted or entirely forgotten, that lingers on the periphery of the mind as a vague spectre that gathers itself into a ghastly, fully fledged form just at the moments we feel we might have expelled it from our psyche, is visited upon us in the dead of night with its harrowing vicissitudes, its fucking brain-dead decision to bring back Palpatine, and a screenwriting equivalent of raising your arms resignedly and going, And then, of course, there was the Star Wars streaming content. And at this, I'm not so much dishing out difficult truths as giving you permission. Permission to let out a cathartic sigh, slide your hands over your face, peer into a conjectural middle distance, nod with somber acknowledgement, and admit that in retrospect, The Mandalorian, with its stupid, hammy cowboy aesthetic, cynically exploitative and twee marketing construct in Baby Yoda, ridiculous female Mandalorians with their boob armor and feminine stylized helmets, an intensely narrow scope of storytelling, actually, when you get down to it, kind of sucked balls in terms of what Star Wars can and should be. Once you've given yourself that permission structure, it becomes easy, a concessionary cascade, to admit that yes, the Book of Boba Fett, with its candy-coloured bike riding, didn't just suck balls, but in fact sucked sweaty post-gym stinking balls. And that Kenobi sucked retch-inducing, vinegary, homeless person who couldn't even be bothered to shower at the Y balls. And that Andor, far from being a marvelous revelation, was, at best, hygienically cleansed and manscaped balls, but by definition, an exercise largely in ball-sucking nonetheless. As a consequence of this saliva-slicked mouth-to-scrotum slurping, the ratings for these shows, particularly the third season of The Mandalorian, are falling off a cliff. But the deeper issue of their failure can be traced back to the assertion from George Lucas about the films. There's nothing new. Because the films lacked any compelling or memorable or endearing new characters, the streaming shows had to default to old established characters, or their equivalents, in Boba Fett knockoff Mando, or middle-aged Obi-Wan Kenobi, or Darth Vader, or Princess Leia, or Mon Mothma for God's sake, an ancillary, super minor character from the original trilogy who gave a minute's worth of exposition. The film and streaming elements of Disney Star Wars seem to be racing each other to come perilously close to smashing into the ground, like that spiraling death dive maneuver in Top Gun Maverick. Star Wars films ought to be the tentpoles of all tentpoles, the one thing in cinema with such universal goodwill, with such an unrivaled multi-generational fanbase, that it would be impossible to fuck up or get into a muddle with. Star Wars streaming content ought to be minor companion material, but instead, Lucasfilm is pumping out soulless streaming content. And the film projects have languished in cinematic purgatory for years, with scripts and possible writers and directors all claiming to be interested, or involved, or signed up, and with the earliest likelihood of a new film being 2.5 years away. When it comes to content, Disney Star Wars has prompted, simultaneously, a flood in the small screen and a drought on the big screen. And then there's the writers. When it comes to fantasy adventure, I want my writers to be eccentric, to be mavericks, to be a bit janky, even a bit messed up, and to have been through some shit. Half a decade before Star Wars, George Lucas's first film was THX 1138, a misanthropic, bleak, post-apocalyptic debut, expressing the jilted cynicism toward society of its quietly spoken director behind his thick glasses. As a young RAF pilot in World War II, Roald Dahl came close to dying after crash landing in the Western Desert. Michael Ende, author of The Never-Ending Story, grew up the child of a bohemian surrealist painter. Recalling the bombing during the war, he said, "Our street was consumed by flames. I remember singing and careering through the blaze like a drunkard. I was in the grip of a kind of euphoria." After the war, he joined an amateur theatrical troupe that travelled from town to town by bus, usually performing on makeshift stages surrounded by beer, smoke, and the clatter of skittles. J.R.R. Tolkien fought in the mud of the Somme. Now consider these writers for the Star Wars show The High Republic, a bunch of blandly inoffensive, chubby and benign people whose chief characteristic would be their convivial niceness, their supportive, creative niceness, their amenable, collaborative niceness. The French have a phrase, le mot juste, which translates as the exactly right word or phrasing, and if we were to clinchingly decide upon le mot juste for these writers, it would be pussy-ish. Not overt pussies, with all its social connotations, but pussy-ish. In other words, liable to be pussies with a general pussy-ish kind of vibe. The woman, heavy-set and androgynous, in every inversely negative association with that term, and the process one of nice soliciting of opinions and ideas in an atmosphere of positively inclusive niceness, with a whiteboard showcasing their priorities. On the fiction side, diversity is listed third. On the Star Wars middle bit, which has an upliftingly jovial and nice love heart, it actually leads off with not pro-war. And in the third, whimsically and nicely titled Star Wars Wishes category, fifth on the list is also representation/diversity. Fuck off. And then there's Marvel. Marvel has gotten to the point where it needed a C-level character in Ant-Man to try and arrest its slide into aggressive mediocrity, even introducing its next Thanos, but in fact coming up with a bloated mess that critics derided as the second worst film in the MCU ever. It's almost as bad as up to 40% of you failing to subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. Marvel has been experiencing superhero fatigue for years now. This was because Phase 4 was such a precipitous drop in quality after what came before, a train wreck that sent the caboose of the train tumbling into a dumpster, which ignited, causing a dumpster fire that spread to a sewage processing plant that erupted in flames in the path of sustainable wind turbines that caused a shitstorm that, once extinguished, left a hot mess. It was an entire phase of dubious writers and directors playing with the leftovers of the Infinity Saga, or wedging and shunting together disparate elements of the MCU into gruesome and unfortunate hybrid forms, like Sid with the toys in Toy Story. It also meant the likes of Taika Waititi with Thor taking once serious characters and centering them as the butt end of jokes. There was a natural curve leading up to Endgame, where much of the potential of the franchise peaked and reached a satisfying conclusion. Everything in its wake would have all the hallmarks and characters and tropes of what people had liked, but with an unsatisfying hollowness, worsened by the contingencies of the multiverse that lowers the stakes and consequences, because characters can be restored irrespective of their on-screen demise. A further important element in this decline has been the rise of identity politics, with studio writers imposing and foregrounding their own values, sometimes at the expense of storytelling and imagination, and with the downplaying of traditional male leads. This imposition of identity politics has sullied the essential magic of a genre which doesn't seem especially suited to the strident insertion of ideological messaging. Along the way, Marvel somehow managed to make even the positive, affirming, and ideal notion of gender empowerment clunkily contentious and grating. Talking about female empowerment in Marvel, Kevin Feige said, "I think we're getting to the point soon where we have so many great female characters that those are just our heroes, as opposed to when they are all female, all male. It's just the Marvel heroes, more than half of which will be women." The thing is, though, if you're going to project an idea of an urgent, unmet need, of a repressed yearning among girls and women to be visible in a universe they feel a deep connection to, then it looks weird if most of the actresses were lukewarm, blasé, or had no connection to any of it as formative influences, or something they cherished or even knew about growing up. Brie Larson has said, quote, "I didn't know Captain Marvel. He was before my time. I wasn't around when some of these comic book superheroes were around. Growing up, I don't remember anything about Captain Marvel." Scarlett Johansson, talking about Black Widow, said, quote, "I knew nothing of the character originally." Elizabeth Olsen has said she, quote, "doesn't like Marvel movies." Letitia Wright, playing Shuri in Wakanda Forever, was, quote, "never a fan of comic books. She knew nothing of the character originally." Also, having one teenage girl boss technology genius who can make Iron Man-style mech suits and goes to MIT and is stunning was already a stretch. But if you then have a second teen girl boss technology genius who can create a portal into a quantum realm in her spare time, that is patently, lamentably, and egregiously stupid. The only thing more confoundingly stupid would be to develop a film called The Marvels, featuring 3 co-leads with shaky, uncertain profiles and goodwill,
That's one dynamic that we can talk about or not.
and for 2 at least, shaky at best name and character recognition, with one coming from a show that bombed heavily, and the other who only had any degree of screen time toward the back end of a streaming show. Compounding the stupidity, you would then incessantly delay this doomed project, do reshoots after purportedly disastrous test screenings, instead of just getting it over with and ripping off the $100 million Band-Aid. Lastly, Disney has even managed to make its theme parks problematic. Even Disney CEO Bob Iger admits that tickets to the company's theme parks cost too much and that it needs to become a more accessible brand. He was unnerved by price hikes at Disney's parks, which include Walt Disney World, Disneyland, and others. Daily admission prices at Disney's theme parks rose to almost $200 last year. Throughout much of the 2010s, Disney hiked fees at roughly double the rate of inflation. Surely, what you wouldn't do as a corporate monolith is continuously hike the prices until they become prohibitively expensive for a lot of everyday folk. So much for the happiest place on earth. Disney used to be synonymous with imagination, creativity, boundary-pushing technology, and whimsical charm. Now, it is synonymous with bastardizing its own product. Willow, with Warwick Davis as the ostensible lead, but really revolving around a young lesbian couple, cancelled after one season. A soulless, critically panned box office bomb in Pinocchio. Rehashed adaptations of The Lion King and Aladdin, a lifeless recontextualization of Buzz Lightyear with an ethnically diverse lesbian marriage, a contrived epic adventure in Strange World which centered a teen gay romance and bombed comprehensively because its foregrounding of identity politics was at the expense of originality and dynamic storytelling. And perhaps, worst of all, Peter Pan and Wendy, with J.M. Barrie's original, charming vision weighed down with identity politics of representation, including lost girls as well as lost boys, all forefronted in the trailer for maximum emphasis. Walt Disney once said, "Laughter is timeless, imagination has no age, and dreams are forever." With modern Disney, the laughter is forced, imagination dulled, and dreams trammeled by divisive and unappealing realities.